This is a Farm Doc Daily webinar on University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason today, macro and farm financial updates. Gerald Mashange is here and Brad Zwilling. They'll be taking you through our program today. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Let's begin the program.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending our webinar. So Brad and I are going to be presenting the macro and farm financial update. And the way we're going to go about this presentation is I'm going to start off by giving you guys a macroeconomic update, looking at interest rates, GDP, credit conditions, and also talking about the Fed outlook as well. And once I'm done with my part of this presentation, I'm going to hand it over to Brad, who will then talk about farm financials using the FBFM data set. So starting off with GDP. So US real GDP increased at an annual rate of 3.1% in the third quarter of 2024, following a 3.3% increase in the second quarter. The main driver behind these increases were consumer spending, exports, federal government expenditures, and non-residential fixed investments. Actually, today, the Commerce Department released their estimate for the fourth quarter of 2024, where GDP actually grew by 2.3%. Which was slower than what we saw in the third quarter. And the estimate for the year was 2.5%. Now, a main driver behind GDP growth is actually consumer spending. It was the same case in the third quarter, and it's the same case in the fourth quarter. And what you can see in this graph over here is that we're back to pre-COVID trends following the peak that we observed and the trough that we observed in the COVID era as well. Now, within consumer spending, the subset of that is food expenditures. And looking at this, we saw that in the third quarter, it actually increased by 1.3%. There's an additional data set from the CPI where we can look at the food at home index, which captures expenditures at the grocery store or supermarkets, and the food away from home, which captures expenditures that are taken at restaurants as well. And looking at the food at home index, that increased at 1.8% in December relative to a year ago. And food away from home actually increased by 3.6%. Now let's move attention now to interest rates. I think that's probably the most important thing that a lot of people are focused on. So before the Fed rate cuts that started in September, the Fed actually increased interest rates starting in March of 2022, and they increased them 11 times. And you can see how steep that increase was. In fact, it was the fastest increase in 40 years. Now, the main idea is if interest rates are high enough, then it should slow down spending and cool down the economy. And the inflation data does show that. But leading into December, what we started seeing that the inflation data started to appear as if it's moving sideways. And more data substantiated that. The new consensus in December was that the Fed should likely pause, and this is exactly what we saw yesterday, where the expectation was no further rate cuts, simply because we need to first make sure that the battle against inflation is won. Now, let's take a look at what that inflation chart looks like. So the Federal Reserve Bank's main tool or a gauge of looking at inflation is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. That's the blue line that you see up there. And sometimes you hear it being referred to as headline inflation. And this captures overall inflation. The orange line, that's personal consumption expenditures that excludes food and energy. So we're trying to strip away the volatility we see in food prices and energy prices. And sometimes you may hear this be referred to as core inflation. As you can see, that interest rates only started being increased in the spring of 2022, and that coincides with the peak of inflation. And then thereafter, we see that downward trend of inflation. But as we got into 2024, as we exited the summer, heading into the fall months, we started seeing, particularly with core inflation, that is the orange line, inflation was moving sideways. And this is partly explains why the Fed had to take pause and reconsider its planned rate cut agenda. The idea was that if inflation continued, if inflation was not coming down, maybe interest rates aren't high enough. And that is why they paused. In addition to that, when you look at the job market, it's quite strong right now. And unemployment is also relatively low at around 4% too. Now, another view of inflation is what the market thinks about it. So we can take a look at the 5-year break-even inflation rate. And as of January 24, 2025, the market expects inflation to be at a 2.52% over the next 5 years. And more so looking at these interest rates, particularly the interest rates that are being faced by producers, we can take a look at the Kansas City Fed's data set, where they have a survey called the District Surveys of Ag Credit Conditions. This is a collection of data coming from different Federal Reserve banks. Across the United States, we have 12 Federal Reserve districts, and Illinois is actually serviced by 2 districts. So parts of Central Illinois and Northern Illinois are serviced by the Chicago Fed, and southern counties in Illinois are serviced by the St. Louis Fed. And what we have up here are the average fixed interest rates on operating loans. And as you can see, relative to the interest rates we saw during the COVID period, we have much higher interest rates. Interestingly, across the 2 districts, these interest rates have actually been moving fairly similar to each other. But the recent trend is that those rates have slowly been coming down. However, when we look at the average fixed interest rates on farm real estate loans, what we see is that there's actually a substantial difference between the 2 districts, where for the Chicago district, fixed interest rates on farm real estate loans is actually much lower compared to that of the St. Louis district. But overall, you're also seeing a downward trend as well in those rates. Now, these higher interest rates are coinciding with softening farm incomes and repayment rates. In addition to this, we're also seeing that working capital has been declining. Brad, myself, and Dwight, we just completed a Farm Doc series looking at liquidity, where we explored different measures of liquidity for Illinois across different regions in Illinois, and we also considered different farm sizes. And we're also finding that liquidity trends are indicating a decline in that as well. So be on the lookout for additional information by going to Farm Doc Daily, just to take a look at that series as well. Now, although we are seeing a deterioration in liquidity, we can take a look at the commercial banks and see how the performance of agricultural loans are doing. So what we have here are delinquency rates across commercial banks, and there's 2 categories to be mindful of here. So when it comes to commercial banks, some commercial banks make more agricultural loans than others. Those commercial banks that specialize in agricultural lending, that is, at least 25% of their loans are agricultural loans, are called agricultural banks. So these are commercial banks that specialize in ag lending. And then for the commercial banks that are also making ag loans, but those loans represent less than 25%, those are the non-ag banks, and those are those orange lines you see up there. And what you can see is that these overall delinquency rates are actually quite low relative to what they were in previous periods. So the main takeaway over here is that we're still at a good state when it comes to the performance of agricultural loans at commercial banks. Now, lastly, let's talk about the Fed outlook. So yesterday, the FOMC met, and Jerome Powell made his announcements when it comes to their plans with interest rates and their overall perception of the US economy. So in the FOMC, it has different participants, and each member has their own opinion in terms of the state of the economy and how they see the economy evolving over time. So what we have over here are the median projections, that is the median opinion across these members. And we have unemployment rate, federal funds rate, inflation through the PCE inflation rate, and growth rate of real GDP. The main takeaway here is that there was an upward revision in the federal funds rate projection. That is, in 2025, we're now expecting only 2 rate cuts instead of 4. So we're likely going to see about 50 basis points decline this year. Now, this could change depending on how this year evolves and when new data comes out as well. Looking at inflation, it's going to slightly tick up to 2.5% in 2025. And the expectation is that by 2026, we're going to be close to that 2% target the Fed is aiming for, and eventually hitting 2% in 2027. Interestingly, for the median projection for the growth rate in real GDP, we're seeing it at 2.1% in 2025. It's interesting because other people have been discussing how a lot of the Trump administration's agenda might be pro-growth. So it's going to be interesting to see how 2025 evolves when it comes to GDP growth. By 2026 and 2027, that median projection looks like it's going to be at 2% and 1.9% respectively. I'm now going to hand it over to Brad, who's going to talk about financial trends of Illinois farms.
Thank you, Gerald. And we're looking at farms that are enrolled in Illinois Farm Business Farm Management. We work with about 5,000 farms, 12,000 farm families. But of those numbers, we're only looking at ones that have gone through a process with our staff that are made them usable to make sure that everything's there on those records, so we have good, accurate data that we're working with to create these trends. And the first trend we're going to look at is just kind of look at overview of kind of income, but we're going to call this operator's share of labor and management income adjusted for inflation. And we're going all the way back to 1972. And when we define operator's share of labor and management income, is basically starting with the accrual net farm income and then taking a charge off for the interest on equity capital, which would mean the portion of the assets that the farmer owns at a set interest rate. So we subtract that off that accrual net farm income and then take off and that's what's left for the operator's share of labor and management income. So if you look at that, we got a couple of different bars here on this slide. In the early 70s, we were really high incomes for that period of time, and then drop back down to the late 70s, early 80s to a period of time that was, our incomes was just a little under zero to a little up to about 100,000 for that period of 1980 to 2006. Then when we move into the period of time in the blue, it's just 2007 to 2012, which is a lot of variability. That's the first time we had some of the highest of high incomes during that period of time, all the way up to 2012 that had the highest year ever of 252,650,000 for labor share of management income. And then we had some poor times, poor yields, higher expenses. That drops us back down here to 2015, what that was our lowest operator share of labor and management income adjusted for inflation of negative $69,000. And we had a period of time, just some ups and downs right around that zero period of time to 2019 at 12,865. In that period of time for 2015 to 2019, when we looking at this operator share of labor and management income was the second lowest ever, at least back to 1972, than what it was over this period of time. The first lowest was 1980 to 1984, and then third lowest was 1985 to 1989. So if you're looking at those periods of time, you can understand where we're looking at when we look at those labor and management income. Then after those low periods of time, we went back up to the highest period of ever in 2022 of 349,000. But look back to where we were in 2023 at negative $63,081. And that's very close to where we were in that low period of time in 2015. So kind of keep this in mind as we go through those different ratios so we can understand what's going on when we look at those income numbers. The first one is a financial efficiency measure, and this is talking about kind of just farm operating income. And this is looking at our farm operating income as a percentage of gross farm returns. And we'll talk about the rest of the financial efficiencies and how they all play together later in the slide presentation. But we look at the last 10 years here, we see that we had some lower years around that 10%. We were up or above that period of time. And then that 2021, 2022 were some of the highest times ever at 30.6 and 31.4%. And over this period of time, you could probably say we averaged about 20%. And over time, that's where we want to be, is at about 20% over those period of time. So that means as a percent of my gross returns, 20% would be left over to have as income that I can use to either expand the operation, put into net worth, or do other things with as well. So we talked about that, maybe expanding or putting money back into the operation. Let's look at our types of assets on a per acre basis, and this is the per acre operated for that farming operation. And we will look at this at a 10-year panel, and you can look at total assets, and we were about $5,000 an acre for the first 7 years of this 10-year panel, and then increased about $600 into 21, another $600 into 2022, and then just a little bit, maybe $100 to $150 an acre to 2023. And so let's look at the different components of these assets to go from those. And these are all assets on the farming operation, including the house and other pieces. So the current would primarily be our grain inventory, intermediate would primarily be our machinery, and our fixed assets would primarily be our farmland. So if you look at those, the same kind of trends we saw in the total assets. So our current assets have been about $1,000 an acre for those first 7 years, and then moved up about $200 each year for those first of these the years 8 and 9, and then year 10 just moved up a little bit. As we all know, with grain prices came down a little bit. So we still had some cash available there that was offsetting those, but just some lower prices brought that down to not see that same increase. Then we look at the intermediate, or the mainly machinery, and that was moving up $100 to $150 an acre on those last 3 years. And then our fixed assets were moving up about $300 to $400 each year. And then last year kind of tailed off a little bit. So you can see the offset, the machinery is probably our big increase from 2020 to 2023 to kind of offset that little bit of drop that we saw in that current assets, not the same increase amount. So just want to kind of give you an overview of those assets so we look at some ratios that are impacted by those. And one asset is just looking at those current assets, and that's our working capital to gross farm returns. So if you take your current assets minus your current liabilities and divide by your gross farm returns, then you get these ratios. And what we're looking at here is the blue line is our average. And so we're looking at that average for the last 20 years. And then we look at what the upper quartile is. And so I wanted to point out what the difference is between the upper quartile and average. And if you look at that period of time, starting about 2013, 2014, we see the average kind of went down a little bit, that working capital gross. And a lot of it was our gross returns went down during that period of time, but also, those are some a little bit tougher times. You remember back to that graph. Well, you can notice the upper quartile really wasn't impacted that much. That means they still were holding on to that working capital, even though that gross returns dropped down. It came down just as much as the gross returns. It stayed fairly level during that period of time. So know that upper quartile is going to fairly stay strong when you look at that working capital to gross returns. But really look what happened in the last 2 to 3 years with those really high incomes really taken off to where we have about 138% in 2023 for that upper quartile versus about 74% of that. And basically what 74% for the average would mean is about 74% of the gross farm returns we had in working cash that we could replace that or have that as to use if we didn't have that quite the return that we had in 2023. Another liquidity measure is current ratio, and this is taking our current assets divided by our current liabilities. And as Gerald said, there's some really good Farm Doc Daily liquidity articles on this that we look at different regions of the state and different sizes. But when we just look at just in general, when we look at the differences here, it's about 2 to 3% difference for those first years in here. And then when we had those really high income years in 21 and 22, we see a 4 to 5 to 6% difference in those current ratios. So the upper quartile is really doing really good when we have high income, but stays about 2 to 3% higher all those other years. When we talk back to those total assets we had, now let's look at those different pieces. So we're looking at the intermediate part of that, and one of the big pieces of that is machinery values. And we look at this and we see that machinery values have really ramped up, especially that period of time, 2007 to 2014. A lot of that was when we had the increase in corn for ethanol. There was also changes happening behind the scenes through IRS and people taking advantage of increased 179 deduction and bonus depreciation. So we doubled that from $300 in 2007 up to 2014, where it was $600 an acre. And those kind of leveled off. We bought a lot of equipment during that period of time, so we weren't buying as much in those other years. We had a little bit lower income. And then we get to 2020, and then that started increasing again. And we got finally back up over $600 an acre in 2021. And then finally now up to $700 an acre in 2023. We bought a lot of equipment, not only as the value increased, but we bought a lot of equipment 2023 to kind of offset that cash tax liability that we were paying in 2023 for that 2022 crop that we sold primarily in 2023. So it'd be interesting to see, I think, if you look at those prior trend, what we saw from 2007 to 2014, we might have another year of that number being up a little bit, but then that might fall off a little bit as we look at our projections for 2024 and 2025. Also, land values were doing the same kind of thing. They were increasing, just not as fast a rate. We look back to 2004 in this graph, and we were at $500,000. And then that doubled when you got to 2010 to $1 million on average for the value of farmland on these average farms that we had. And then it took all the way to 2021 to double again to $2 million. And if you look back from 2019 to 2023, we had a 38% increase those last couple of years. Not only was that farmland increasing, but also farmers were buying more farmland. They had a lot of cash from those income. And you look for an alternative investment, farmland was still a very good investment for them. So they were buying farm ground as well on average. When we look at those main pieces on a farm balance sheet, that would be the machinery, farm buildings, and farmland. Look at this chart here. We go back to, we had about $750,000 in 2004. You can see the big component of that. There's that farmland big increase, machinery increase. But even look at farm buildings. It's not a very big piece of this overall portion, but there's a special piece, which was a special bonus depreciation, has allowed a lot more farm buildings to be put up and take 50% up to 100% of that asset and write off as a current deduction instead of depreciating over 20 years. So a lot of people took advantage of those if it was a machine shed. And we look at that now, we're over $3.5 million in 2023. So you can see how fast our assets have grown in that period of time. And once again, this is just farmland, farm buildings, and machinery. So we've looked at all those assets. Let's look a little bit about that debt and the interest paid as we look at those. And this is strictly just farm interest paid as a percent of gross farm returns. And before we really measured debt to asset ratio, this was seen as a kind of an alternative to the solvency ratio. And we look at this, we go back to the early 80s here, and we had a high interest to a percent of gross at 14.6. And that has been gradually moving down to the lowest period there in 2012, 2013 at 2.5%. And then started creeping up a little bit because we had, about the same amount of interest on those farms, but our gross was lower, got down to 2.3, the lowest ever in this period of time here in 2022, and then creeped up to 3.9% in 2023. Higher interest rates, more interest being paid, and then lower gross as well happened to make that go. And then let's look at our total debt. And this is not just farm debt, this is all debt that we'd have on those balance sheets. And this is the same information, the top and the bottom, but we peel off each one of those so you can see that short-term debt, which would be operating debt primarily, and land debt, the long-term debt, pretty much followed about the same on a total value on average throughout those farms until about 2018, 2019, and then they split off. Well, our incomes were fairly good. We had a lot of liquidity, so we probably weren't using much short-term debt, but we were still buying land. You remember what we saw in that 39% increase there in that farmland. So we've been increasing there. And our intermediate debt, it's at the bottom there in the top part of this slide, but still has grown from about 50,000 to 130,000 on average in that period of time here. And then you go back and look at all of them combined together, and we're looking at about $300,000 of total debt in 2003, up to over $1 million in 2023. That seems like a good increase. But remember back when we looked at just the machinery, the farm buildings, and the farm land, we had $3.5 million. So if you look at that, just looking at those pieces, we have about $2 million of net worth on these farms still, just when we're looking at strictly those pieces, not looking at other investments like their land as their house or the other investments they have that off the farm. So fairly good, strong financial position when you look at just the net worth piece and the total assets. But you notice that those farm assets have been increasing a lot faster than this farm debt. And this kind of shows that here as well. We talk about debt to asset ratio, and this is looking all the way back to a panel from 1992 to 2023. You see what that debt to asset ratio has been doing. It was well over 30% way back in the early 90s and has been coming down all the way to the lowest number ever in this panel in 2023 at 17%. However, look what our debt to acre has been doing, is grown up to over $800 an acre. Remember that machinery was at $700 an acre if you go back to those pieces. And then our interest payment, this is one I'm kind of watching. We've typically been about $15 to $20 an acre over this whole period of time until you got to 21, and in 22 we went over that $25 an acre, and then all the way up to $34 an acre in 2023. A lot of debt, a lot more interest rates, so it's going to be something we need to start paying attention to, because we've been in that low interest rate environment for so long, Gerald, that this is going to be something that plays. And luckily we've been seeing a little bit of those rates come down a little bit, but the amount of debt we're setting on those farms, now we're having to finance those at higher rates. If we're buying machinery or buying farm ground, that's a lot higher interest rate, or other decisions we make on the farm that's impacted by that interest. So one thing with that amount of debt, we got to think about how we repayment, and one way to measure that is term debt ratio, which is basically taking your term payments and interest dividing by what you have available to pay that. And this is showing the upper quartile and the average, as well as we've looked at a lot of the other ratios that we've shown. And you can see here, once again, this is like our current ratio, where in those good years, that term debt ratio really is a big difference between the upper quartile and the lower quartile. So it seems like in the poor years, it stays about the same. The average years, it stays about the same. But in those good years, that upper quartile just really does really well to have, a repayment capacity or ratio of 12 to almost $14 or 14% versus 5 for those. And those are really strong. Basically a 1 means I can meet all of my term debt requirements. And you look back over this 10-year panel here that we have, and there's only been 1 year that we've not been able to do that. And that was in 2015, which, back to our original first slide, when we looked at these, that was the lowest year ever in that period of time when we adjust for inflation. So going back to our solvency, we're breaking this out by age because this is very important. When you hear people talk about debt to asset ratio, this solvency measure, you need to make sure you know what age bracket you kind of fall in. If you look at, we know what incomes have done in 21, 22, and 23, right? The highest years ever in 21 and 22, and 23 came down. Look how much the group from 50 and up has been impacted by those high incomes. Those debt to asset ratios really haven't moved much. But look back to that less than 30 and 30 to 40. That debt to asset ratio went from 38% to 46% on that less than 30 group. And that's a thing to watch. If it gets over 50%, that means my lender owns more of my assets than I do. Now, once again, less than 30 years, most of those assets are in the current assets, which would be inventory and maybe a little machinery, versus the ones that are 50 and plus. There's a lot more of those fixed assets, a longer term investment for them, but they don't have as much repayment years, such as somebody that's less than 30. So it can take a little bit higher debt to asset ratio. And you can look at that variability that we've seen. Remember, overall, on average, that's been coming down, but look at that less than 30 over the last 10 years, a lot of movement back and forth, up and down, and a couple of years in there over 50%. And when we talk about the good years that we've had on average for all those farms. And we talked about that farm operating income ratio. Now let's put all these together, a financial efficiency ratio, and look and see how they play. So basically, you're taking interest plus farm operating income plus depreciation plus operating expense, and that's going to equal our gross farm returns. So you can see how each one of these pieces play to what the impact's going to be on the other. So if we look at this graph, we can say about interest has been about 3 to 4% of that total. Farm operating income has been, up and down, but it's about 20%, if you can say, and depreciation's been anywhere from 7 to 10%, and operating expense has been about 65 to 67% on average over this 20-year picture here. And so if we look at this, we can use it to help do some forward projection to kind of think about things. For 2023, our operating expenses were about 80%, and then depreciation be 10%. So that's already 90%. And about, let's just make it easy math, 5% for interest. That means we had 5% left that would be farm operating income. So if we look at 24, where those numbers are going to come out, we're just, with FBFM, we're just getting ready to pull those in and start running through those in about a month from now. But if you look at that, our farm operating income, our operating expenses are probably going to come down a little bit, but so did our gross. Our depreciation is going to be there or higher because we bought so much in the last couple of years, and interest is probably going to be larger. So the impact on farm operating income is probably still going to be that low 4% or less going forward because of those other impacts that are going on, because we know depreciation, we know interest, we know the operating expenses probably came down a little bit, but maybe about the same amount our gross was. So it'll be interesting to see where this comes out. But just some numbers you can think about, where does that gross go in this piece of basically a piece of a pie each year? Finally, we talk about that piece of the pie. One thing you have to think about is you have the farm income. What else is going on? So on our farms, we have about 1,300 farm families that reconcile every dollar in and out of their farm and family operation. And so when we look at this, we're looking at the total family living with taxes of $143,000 in 2023. You can see where that's been, and that's the highest ever. And that's about family living expenses, everything from the blue down, the expendables, medical, family living, capital, contributions, and life insurance. That was over $105,000. That was a record for Illinois FBFM. But the good thing was the net non-farm income, that was the highest ever, over $60,000. So when you look at those things, we have $143,000 of family living in taxes. We can offset that with $60,000 for the net non-farm income. That gives us $80,000 that we have to cover from the farm income. If you go back, remember we had a negative 69,000 for labor and management income. That equated to about 70,000 in net farm income. That means there was 10,000 short that had to come from somewhere else or pull out of net worth. So family living, I don't see coming down for 2024 or 2025. The tax liability still will probably be up there. That was what they paid last April, March of 2024. So off-farm income hopefully will be offset what that family living and taxes will be. So we're still going to be short again with the income being projected what that is for 2024. So just being aware of that another year that we may be pulling a little bit out of net worth or somewhere else. And finally, just some overall when we think something to think about, we have so much assets out there and so much liabilities. What are we carrying forward? What are we pushing that can down the road, right? And when we look at this is basically looking at my estimated deferred tax. If I had to sell everything, where I would be. And this is looking at if I had to sell everything lock, stock, and barrel as of that year, that's what would happen. And if we look at that, we are about 200,000 in 2023, and over the last 20 years has grown to over $1 million of tax liability that's out there. Now, I know most farmers were planning on moving that on, and that probably never will sell that land. And if you say that about each one is a third, long-term, intermediate, and current, there's still about $600,000. So if I have to sell off all my machinery and all my land, that's about $600,000 on average would be what I have a deferred tax liability if I do all that in the year that I retire, or I'm deciding to transition out of farming, whatever that would be, something to think about as you move along during those pieces. So, there's a lot of talk about transition planning, and this is one thing that why it's so critical that you're doing your balance sheets and thinking about this. This is something you probably not thought about over that period of time as these assets have really grown. There's a tax liability out there against those. So you have to think about how you transition those and how that's going to impact the amount of cash available for that operation to move on to the next generation as well. With that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Todd.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Brad. A couple of things as you're putting questions into the question box for Brad Zwilling and for Gerald Mashange. We would appreciate you doing that now. Upcoming webinars include next week on Tuesday, a webinar about precision conservation management, how you can use it to drive profitability, especially out of the data. Greg Goodwin will join us. And then on Thursday, we'll continue our IFES webinar series. It'll be the fourth, I believe, in the series. Alternative ag insurance products. Brittney Goodrich will be here. We would appreciate you taking some time with that. A couple of other things. We'd like to thank our sponsors as well. They include for the day the TIA Center for Farmland Research, CoBank, Compere Financial, Corteva AgriScience, Farm Credit Illinois, Growmark, the Illinois Corn Growers Association, and the Illinois Soybean Association, along with our FarmDoc educational partners like the College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics, Illinois Extension, the Gardner Ag Policy Program, and FBFM, which brings us back to Brad Zwilling. Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Gerald, for being with us today. I don't know that we have questions to answer at the moment. Somebody did ask if we record these. The answer, of course, if they have not seen that answer, is yes. Otherwise, if you wanted to summarize, Brad and Gerald, what we just saw in a few short sentences, how would you do that as it relates to the farm?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, Gerald, and you can follow up. So, the financial positions we're in a really good financial position. Yes, we're not as strong as we were in 22 and 23, or 21 and 22, but still very good, strong position as you look back over the last 10 to 20 years. I think that the key is where we are going to have to sharpen that pencil going through. We know 24 is done, but figure out where 24 ended up with our financial information. But also think about 25. We've seen those budgets where they've come out. We know we've got the economic assistance. That's going to help our 24 numbers finalize out where they're going to be. So I think on the farm, 24, we're going to be okay. I think we just still need to really watch our numbers and keep track of that as we go forward, because I think we're in for some, a little bit, use more of our liquidity out, as Gerald mentioned, those presentations, those FarmDoc daily papers.
Absolutely. And also you can take a look at the American Bankers Association and Farmer Mac's survey that came out in August. It's a really good resource just to get an understanding of what lenders are thinking about. So part of the motivation behind our recent liquidity series was really addressing that top concern, which is working capital and liquidity overall. Thing to note is that they also in that report indicate that credit standards are going to tighten in 2025. And obviously with the Fed announcing that they're pausing those interest rate cuts, this means that in January and in March when they meet again, there's likely not going to be an additional cut. So we're likely going to see these interest rates prevailing through planting season. Again, things can change. If we see inflation pick up again in the next few months, maybe then we might see a reversal in that. So overall, we are paused when it comes to interest rates, just waiting for more data to come in.
Now, if you have
We do
questions
have a
for
question
Brad,
to come in, and that's what the average means. Is it included in the top quartile? And what that is really that average is our median. So that would not be included there. It's just picking where that 50%, if you lined all the numbers where the middle would be, that's what the average is. So it would not be including that upper quartile.
Yeah, and typically what you'll see is that, why we try to include averages and quartiles is that with averages, it can be influenced by really large figures or really small figures. But then when you break it down in terms of the distribution of these numbers, the quartile is really representing this top 75% and above. And what we see in those figures clearly shows there's a massive difference between the averages and the top quartile, regardless of what metric you're measuring.
Another
if
question
you have
came
questions,
in is, oh, sorry.
if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the question box. And if you're looking for that box, it's up in the right-hand corner of your screen. That doesn't matter whether you're on a desktop or a smaller device for that. There is another question in the list, in fact, at this point. They would like to know if you have the breakdown of the deferred tax liabilities by age cohort.
Yeah, that's a question that we've talked about. We do have a spreadsheet that we use for our internal for our clients, but we haven't done a study on that on an age basis. That's a great question, but we have not done that piece yet. We were just wanting to get that conversation started out there, and we haven't really dug into that. But we would have that information, just haven't spent time and broke that out yet.
Thank you much to both of you. Just a quick reminder for everybody who's watching, and you've got a couple of seconds to put in another question if you can. We do have webinars that are coming up most every week, all of the time. Next week, there will be 2 of them, in fact. The PCM webinar is coming up on Tuesday, February the 4th, with Greg Goodwin. He'll be introducing some precision conservation management and approaches to combining the data analysis there in order to support and optimize maximum profitability on the farm. And then on Thursday, we'll return to this series, including Brittney Goodrich. She'll be talking about alternative ag insurance products. You want to be there for that one. You are already signed up for the second in those 2, or the one on Thursday with Brittney, because you're here today. So you'll get a notice on that one. So be ready and be aware that that's coming up. I think there is another question that has come in. Brad, can you go through it, please?
Yeah. Is it possible for you to exclude the operations that are entirely debt-free from your data set, thinking that this operations might skew the averages? Yeah, that's a great thought. We've always thought about doing something with that, but we still want to include in there because that's a true part of the averages, what's going on in Illinois. But, I see where the thought is to kind of let's look at the ones that have more at risk, right? Because they're borrowing that money and see where those are at. So that's something we haven't done. The data is there, and that's easy to do. Gerald, I think we got another Farm Doc Daily series coming up. So,
but also just to add on to that, this is a great question. If you think about what averages truly are, right? We're taking that entire data set and we're trying to see what the average number is across it, right? But unfortunately, you're going to have some figures where some operators have really low levels of debt, others have really high levels of debt. And sometimes that does muddy things out. If we start removing low levels of debt or high levels of debt, we're not truly representing what the average is across the state. But this is where the chart that Brad showed you with quartiles comes in, right? Where you can think about quartiles as the upper quartile representing the 75% of that data set and above, and then the lower quartile, which is 25% and lower. And depending on the metric you're looking at, you're actually able to gauge what the distribution might look like. So yes, averages can definitely get influenced by those outliers, so high levels or low levels, but having a reference, an idea of what averages and the upper quartile and the lower quartile, including the median, and where the median is representing what the middle is. So right at the middle of that data set, what that figure is. So looking at all of that stuff in combination is a much better illustration of what's really going on.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. Jim Baltz, who is behind the scenes, thank you as well for putting together this webinar. Remember, you can always find it again if you'd like on our website at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu, or you can just check out the YouTube channel at youtube.com/@FarmDoc. Thank you for joining us. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason for this FarmDoc webinar.